Hi, I'm Rufus Brown, and welcome. Take a moment to think about what the word socialism conjures up in your mind. Is it universal healthcare, like what you see in Canada or Germany? Or is it long breadlines, authoritarian regimes, and the defunct Soviet Union? In virtually every other wealthy democracy from Sweden to Japan, ideas like subsidized education, strong labor unions, and comprehensive social safety nets are considered normal, fundamental features of a mixed economy. Yet, here in the United States, these same concepts are instantly weaponized, branded as dangerous, radical, and fundamentally un-American. This is the great paradox we need to unpack. To do that, we first need to define our terms. We're not talking about communism, the authoritarian system that demands state control of all, production, and single-party rule. We're focusing on democratic socialism, the push for a robust welfare state and collective responsibility within a functioning, free market democracy. This video is an investigation into why the fear of socialism is so ingrained in the American psyche. Our thesis is simple. The fear isn't truly about economic theory. It's a powerful cocktail of deliberate Cold War propaganda, a uniquely potent belief in rugged individualism, and the historical conflation of moderate social programs with failed totalitarian states. We'll trace this journey beginning long before the Soviet Union, back to the early 20th century labor panics. We'll follow the money trail behind the modern media backlash, and finally, we'll examine how a new generation is forcing us to confront whether our national identity should be built on competitive self-reliance or shared security. Let's dive inside the American fear of socialism. Chapter 1. The Red Scare of 1919 and Early Labor Panic. The Soviet Union hadn't even reached its full authoritarian height when America first began to panic about the political left. The true origin of the socialism is un-American doctrine lies in the chaotic aftermath of World War I. In 1917, the Bolsheviks seized power in Russia, an event that wasn't just a political change, but a seismic ideological shockwave. Capital owners across the West looked at Moscow and saw the ultimate threat to their wealth and power. Suddenly, the United States, still reeling from the stresses of war and the influx of new immigrants, became fertile ground for paranoia. This fear was immediately tied to the powerful rise of the American labor movement. Organizations like the Industrial Workers of the World, or Wobblies, weren't just asking for better wages. They challenged the fundamental structure of capital ownership. To industrial barons and government officials, these demands weren't simple collective bargaining. They were the first shots of a revolutionary war being imported from Europe. The government responded with ruthless force, ushering in the first Red Scare. The peak of this domestic war on dissent was the era of the Palmer Raids. Orchestrated by Attorney General A. Mitchell Palmer and his ambitious young aide, J. Edgar Hoover, the raids of 1919 and 1920 were a constitutional travesty. Without warrants or evidence, thousands of suspected radicals, primarily immigrants and labor activists, were rounded up, detained in inhumane conditions, and often immediately deported. The message was clear. Any dissent that smelled of radicalism was treasonous and foreign. This psychological branding was devastatingly effective. Socialism was removed from the realm of political debate and placed squarely in the category of criminal, violent, and alien conspiracy. This fear permeated the justice system, too. The infamous case of Nicola Sacco and Bartolomeo Vanzetti, two Italian immigrant anarchists accused of robbery and murder, became a global symbol of this tainted justice. Though evidence against them was shaky, their political beliefs were put on trial alongside the alleged crime, leading to their execution in 1927. The ruling class had successfully established that radical thought was incompatible with American liberty, long before the Cold War began. This early violent suppression set the stage for the next, far more encompassing chapter of fear: the geopolitical weaponization of communism. Chapter 2. The Cold War conflation, communism versus socialism. If the first Red Scare laid the foundation of fear, the Cold War built the skyscraper of paranoia. The geopolitical struggle against the Soviet Union provided the perfect existential enemy, and U.S. political leaders seized the opportunity to implement the doctrine of equivalence. This was a simple yet devastatingly effective psychological strategy. Intentionally and consistently conflate the terms socialism and communism. The nuances of economic policy were irrelevant. Any policy that advocated for more state involvement in the economy, from public housing to a national health service, was framed as the thin edge of the wedge, an incremental step leading inevitably to Stalinist totalitarianism. In the American mind, Moscow's single-party state and Sweden's generous welfare programs became morally and politically indistinguishable. The chief architect of this institutionalized terror was Senator Joseph McCarthy. The era of McCarthyism didn't just hunt for Soviet spies. It conducted a moral inquisition. Being labeled a socialist sympathizer or fellow traveler was enough to land you on the blacklist, destroying careers in Hollywood, academia, and government. The goal was to create a social and professional deterrent so powerful that no one would dare discuss left-wing politics openly. The fear was internalized. Advocating for a higher minimum wage wasn't progressive, it was potentially treasonous. This narrative was relentlessly reinforced by popular culture. Films like Red Dawn, educational PSAs, and even comic books portrayed the Soviet threat not just as a military danger, but as a silent virus that would infect American culture and family life, promising equality but delivering oppression. By the 1950s, the terms socialist and American had been rendered mutually exclusive in the mainstream political vocabulary. This calculated conflation remains the single most powerful barrier to policy debate today, ensuring that when modern politicians propose universal preschool, their opponents can simply point to the collapse of the USSR. Chapter 3. The Gospel of American Exceptionalism and Individualism. Chapter 2 showed how political and media manipulation conflated communism with socialism. But that manipulation wouldn't have worked if it hadn't landed on fertile cultural ground. The deep spiritual belief in American exceptionalism and rugged individualism. This is the third, and perhaps most crucial ingredient in the fear cocktail. The foundational American myth is the American dream. The idea that anyone, regardless of background, can rise to the top through sheer grit, talent, and hard work. This myth is simultaneously aspirational and profoundly unforgiving. Within this framework, if you are successful, you are owed every dollar of your wealth as a testament to your virtue. Conversely, if you fail, if you end up struggling, that failure is not the result of systemic inequality or economic shocks, it is a moral failing, proof that you didn't try hard enough. This mindset inherently clashes with the core tenets of socialism, which emphasize collective responsibility and shared security. A social safety net, to the rugged individualist, is an economic system that penalizes the virtuous and rewards the indolent. It is a system that undermines the very mechanism of the American dream by suggesting that success is not purely individual, but also dependent on communal resources. The concept is amplified by the Protestant work ethic, historically prevalent in the U.S. This viewpoint subtly implies that idleness is sinful and self-reliance is godly. Therefore, being dependent on the government, whether for healthcare, housing, or education, is seen not merely as a financial arrangement, but as a corrosive threat to personal liberty and character. Furthermore, the American legal and philosophical tradition holds private property rights as almost sacred. Any policy of wealth redistribution, such as progressive taxation to fund universal services, is framed not as a necessary collective investment, but as outright tyranny, the government seizing the rightful spoils of individual effort. This potent combination of moralistic capitalism and anti-authoritarian paranoia ensures that for a significant portion of the country, socialism will always represent an existential threat, not an economic proposal. Chapter 4. The Weaponization of the Welfare State. While the Cold War taught Americans to fear Soviet-style communism, post-civil rights politics taught many to resent government welfare. The expansion of social programs during the Great Society era, though intended to combat poverty, became a powerful and divisive tool. Politicians began to carefully distinguish between social insurance, like Social Security and Medicare, which were framed as earned entitlements for the respectable elderly, and welfare, which was often racially and class-coded as support for the undeserving poor. This rhetoric created a damaging zero-sum game mentality. Instead of seeing social spending as a collective investment that benefits all of society, the narrative became one of simple transfer. Your hard-earned tax dollars are being taken to support someone who didn't work for it. The most potent symbol of this weaponization was the political trope of the welfare queen, a fictionalized caricature popularized in the 1970s and 80s that suggested widespread abuse of government aid. Though statistically negligible, this powerful image was incredibly successful at diverting attention from systemic issues like deindustrialization and poverty, focusing resentment instead onto the recipients. This distinction is why programs like Social Security remain politically untouchable today. They are universal, providing a shared benefit across classes, and recipients are seen as having paid into the system. But when a modern politician proposes a new universal program, like a public health insurance option or universal childcare, the old language is instantly resurrected. Opponents frame these programs as a moral hazard, a nanny state that infantilizes citizens, removes personal responsibility, and leads to chronic dependency. The ultimate tragedy of this political strategy is the breakdown of class solidarity. Fear of paying for the other prevents working and middle-class voters from uniting to support universal programs like high-quality public healthcare or guaranteed family leave that would overwhelmingly benefit their own financial and personal security. This carefully manufactured class resentment, fueled by racialized messaging, has served as a firewall against the expansion of the American welfare state for decades. Chapter 5: The Corporate and Media Backlash Machine. The fear of socialism isn't just an accident of history or an emotional reaction to cultural myths. It is, above all, a highly sophisticated and consistently funded political project. Powerful economic interests, recognizing that policies like universal healthcare or strong climate regulation represent direct threats to their profit margins, have invested billions in keeping the anti-socialist fear alive. This machine operates through several layers, the most prominent being the network of conservative think tanks groups like the Cato Institute and the Heritage Foundation. These organizations churn out policy papers and academic-sounding studies that promote unfettered capitalism and relentlessly demonize any government intervention as creeping socialism. These documents become the primary source for talking points used by politicians and media figures alike, subtly shifting economic debate from policy substance to ideological warfare. This narrative is then amplified by the coordinated nature of modern conservative media. Cable news, talk radio, and influential digital platforms consolidate and repeatedly broadcast the message, ensuring the conflation of democratic proposals with failed totalitarian regimes like Venezuela or the historical USSR remains the dominant instantaneous association. The language policing is critical. The word socialist is used strategically as a trigger to shut down debate, deliberately activating the deep-seated fears and Cold War conditioning of older generations. This corporate opposition is also acutely focused on labor unions. Campaigns to dismantle organized labor are consistently framed not as a way to reduce wages or control workers, but as necessary resistance to a Marxist or radical influence that disrupts the harmonious employer-employee relationship. By linking the right to organize with the specter of revolutionary change, corporations effectively isolate workers and prevent the kind of collective bargaining that often leads to calls for broader social security. The goal is simple: to make sure the general public remains convinced that free market fundamentalism is the only road to liberty. Chapter 6: The Modern Test Case. Nordic and European Models. Chapter 5 established the opposition's funding and strategies. Now, in Chapter 6, we pivot to the modern counter-argument, the reality of democratic socialism in practice. For decades, the U.S. debate has been rooted in the ghost of the Soviet Union. But today, when modern American progressives like Bernie Sanders use the term socialism, they aren't citing Marx. They're citing Copenhagen and Oslo. This is crucial. Contemporary democratic socialism isn't about state ownership of all industry. It's about building a capitalist welfare state, a high-functioning, free market economy combined with a robust social safety net funded by high taxes and collective responsibility. Take the Nordic model as the prime example. Countries like Denmark, Sweden, and Norway consistently rank among the world's best for economic competitiveness, innovation, and critically, quality of life. They have universal healthcare, virtually free college tuition, strong labor unions, and generous parental leave. Their economies are dynamic, but their citizens are secure. In these countries, high taxes are seen not as a punishment for success, but as a premium on a comprehensive shared insurance policy. The state provides security, which in turn encourages risk-taking and entrepreneurship. If you fail to launch a business in Stockholm, you don't face medical bankruptcy. You receive unemployment and retraining. The fear that socialism crushes innovation is directly contradicted by these models. Opponents in the U.S., however, rarely engage with this reality. They consistently use the technique we discussed in Chapter 2, jumping straight from socialism to failed authoritarian regimes like Venezuela or Cuba, deliberately ignoring the successful European examples. This strategic misdirection shields the U.S. from having an honest debate about policy effectiveness. But the fear is beginning to fracture, largely due to a generational shift. Younger Americans who have no memory of the Cold War and are instead defined by crushing student debt, stagnant wages, and high medical costs view these universal systems pragmatically. For them, the Nordic model isn't a communist threat. It's a desirable standard of living. This pragmatic view is the strongest challenge yet to the deeply ingrained fear of socialism. Chapter 7: The Future of the Fear. We've explored the long, complex history of the American fear of socialism. It is sustained by three powerful forces: the historical ghost of Soviet totalitarianism, which allows opponents to skip logical policy debate; the cultural faith in rugged individualism, which morally frames collective help as personal failure; and the well-funded corporate opposition machine, which actively uses media to amplify these fears. This perfect storm has kept the U.S. debate stuck in a Cold War loop, unable to evaluate policies based on their outcomes. However, the ground is shifting beneath this fear. The defining economic realities for the rising generation: crippling student loan debt, a stagnant minimum wage that requires multiple jobs to survive, and a healthcare system that guarantees medical bankruptcy, are forcing a pragmatic reassessment. For them, the argument that socialized medicine will lead to communism rings hollow when the alternative is financial ruin. The abstract threat of tyranny is being outweighed by the concrete burden of debt. This is fundamentally changing the American concept of security and liberty. For the individualist, freedom means freedom from government interference and taxes. But for a growing number of Americans, freedom means freedom from paralyzing anxiety over a chronic illness or a car accident. It means the freedom to start a business or pursue an education without risking financial oblivion. They see systems like those in Northern Europe, where security fosters risk-taking, as true liberty, not tyranny. Furthermore, existential challenges like the climate crisis demand massive, coordinated government intervention and public investment in new infrastructure, exactly the kind of large-scale collective action that the anti-socialist framework seeks to prevent. It is becoming increasingly difficult to fight a global crisis while simultaneously arguing that any large-scale public project is inherently radical or inefficient. The future of this fear, therefore, is tied less to ideology and more to necessity. As economic vulnerability increases and global challenges demand collective response, the historical and cultural weapons used to silence the debate are losing their bite. The fight over socialism is really a fight over whether America's future will be defined by competitive self-reliance or by the resilience of a shared security. Thank you for joining me for this deep dive. I'm Rufus Brown, and I'll see you next time.